In a charming two-story house on Willow Lane, the Parkers lived what appeared to be the quintessential suburban life. Laura Parker was a 38-year-old housewife who, from the outside, seemed to have everything. She was striking, with warm brown eyes and hair that cascaded in soft waves down her shoulders. She had an easy, welcoming smile that made everyone feel at ease, and a laugh that was often heard at neighborhood gatherings. Her husband, Tom, was a kind-hearted man, known for his sense of humor and his hard-working nature. He worked long hours at his office downtown, always striving to provide the best for his family. Together, Laura and Tom had two children, 12-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Nathan. Emily was a bright girl who loved to read and was already showing signs of a burgeoning talent for painting. Nathan was energetic and full of curiosity, with an affinity for collecting bugs and asking endless questions about the world. They were the kind of family that people looked up to, stable, happy, and loving. But appearances can be deceiving, and behind the closed doors of their picturesque home, there was an emptiness that Laura felt with increasing intensity. Tom's long hours at work, which he justified as necessary for their financial well-being, left Laura alone for most of the day. She loved her children dearly, but she missed the companionship she and Tom used to share. In the beginning, they had been inseparable. Tom was attentive, charming, and full of dreams, and Laura had felt like the center of his world. But as the years went by, the demands of work and the responsibilities of raising children took their toll. Tom grew more distant, and their conversations became shorter, often limited to discussions about the kids or household chores. The spark that had once defined their relationship had faded, and Laura found herself yearning for more. Laura's days became predictable, even monotonous. She would wake up early, prepare breakfast for her family, and see Emily and Nathan off to school. After that, her time was filled with chores, laundry, cleaning, grocery shopping, and making sure everything was in order before the kids returned home. She often found herself staring at the clock, counting down the hours until she had something to do. She tried to fill the void with hobbies, gardening, baking, even taking up knitting, but nothing seemed to satisfy the growing sense of restlessness inside her. Then one bright summer morning, Laura met Jason. The Harrisons, who had moved into the house next door a few weeks earlier, were a friendly couple in their 40s. They had one son, Jason, who was 19 years old. He was tall, with a lean-build, messy dark hair, and a smile that seemed to carry both mischief and innocence. Laura first noticed him when she was watering the flowers in her front yard, and he was helping his parents move some heavy boxes into their new home. "Hey there," Jason had called out, flashing her a bright smile as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You have a beautiful garden." Laura had looked up, slightly surprised but pleased by the compliment. She smiled back. "Thank you. I've put a lot of work into it." "Well, it shows," Jason said, leaning against the fence that separated their yards. "I'm Jason, by the way." "Laura," she replied. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Their first interaction was brief, but it left a lasting impression on Laura. There was something about Jason that intrigued her, his confidence, his youth, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her. Over the next few days, they ran into each other more often. Jason would be outside, helping his parents with yard work, and Laura would find herself making excuses to be in her front yard, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. It wasn't long before their casual waves turned into conversations over the fence. Jason was charming in a way that was different from Tom. He was young, full of energy, and had a carefree attitude that Laura found refreshing. He talked about his plans for the future, how he was taking a gap year before college, how he wanted to travel and see the world. Laura found herself laughing at his stories, enjoying the way he spoke with such enthusiasm and optimism. She realized that she looked forward to their conversations, that she felt a flutter of excitement whenever she saw him. One day, as they were chatting over the fence, Jason offered to help her carry in some heavy bags of groceries. Laura hesitated for a moment, but then smiled and accepted. She led him into the house, and as they put away the groceries, they talked and laughed. The house, which had felt so empty for so long, suddenly seemed warm and full of life. From that day on, Jason began coming over more often. He would help Laura with little tasks around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, changing a light bulb, moving a piece of furniture. Laura found herself enjoying his company more than she should have. She knew it was wrong, that she was a married woman and Jason was just a boy. But she couldn't help the way she felt. Jason made her feel alive again, made her feel seen in a way that Tom hadn't in years. One humid afternoon, when Tom was at work and the kids were at school, Jason came over to help fix a leaking faucet in the kitchen. As he worked, Laura stood nearby, handing him tools, their conversation light and easy. At one point, their hands brushed as she handed him the wrench, and they both paused, their eyes meeting. The air seemed to thicken around them, and Laura could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Before she could think, she leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, but it was enough to ignite something between them. Jason responded, dropping the wrench as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, Laura felt like she was drowning in the intensity of it. It was as if all the loneliness, all the longing she had felt over the years, was pouring out of her in that kiss. After that day, everything changed. Their relationship became a tangled mess of passion and secrecy. When Tom was at work and the kids were at school, Jason would come over, and they would spend hours together, wrapped in each other's arms. It was thrilling, forbidden, and consuming. Laura knew it was wrong, that she was betraying her husband and putting everything she had built at risk. But she couldn't stop. She felt alive for the first time in years, and she wasn't ready to let that feeling go. But as the weeks went by, the thrill of the affair began to wear off, and Laura found herself wanting more. She wanted Jason all the time, not just in stolen moments. She wanted to be with him openly, without hiding, without pretending. The thought of going back to her old life, of living in the shadows, became unbearable. And that was when the dark thoughts began to creep into her mind. What if Tom wasn't in the picture anymore? What if she could be free to love Jason without hiding, without fear? At first, the thought scared her. She wasn't a violent person. She had never hurt anyone in her life. But the more she thought about it, the more it began to make sense. Tom was the one thing standing between her and happiness. If he were gone, she could be free. She could start over, have the life she had always dreamed of. The idea turned into an obsession, and soon Laura found herself thinking about it all the time. She began planning, considering different ways it could be done. She knew Tom had a heart condition, something that could be used to her advantage. If she could make it look like an accident, no one would suspect a thing. Laura knew she couldn't do it alone, and she needed Jason to help her. One afternoon, as they lay in bed together, she decided to bring it up. She spoke slowly, carefully, testing the waters. "Jason," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What if Tom wasn't around anymore?" Jason looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Laura hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "What if something happened to him? What if we could be together without hiding, without sneaking around?" Jason's eyes widened in shock as he realized what she was suggesting. He pulled away from her, sitting up. "You can't be serious, Laura. That's crazy." But Laura was serious. She needed him to see that this was the only way. She talked about how miserable she was, how Tom made her feel small, how they could finally be happy if he was gone. She told Jason that he loved her, that they could have a life together, one without secrets, without fear. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he was torn between his love for her and the horror of what she was suggesting. Slowly, Jason's reluctance began to crack. He was young, impulsive, and too in love with Laura to think rationally. He wanted to be with her, and he wanted to make her happy. The thought of losing her was unbearable, and if this was what it took to be with her, then maybe he could do it. Laura had a plan, a twisted, desperate plan. Tom had a heart condition, and she knew that with the right amount of stress, it could be fatal. She convinced Jason to help her stage a break-in. The idea was simple. Jason would sneak into the house late at night, wearing a mask to make it look like a robbery. He would scare Tom just enough to trigger a heart attack, and Laura would be there to witness the tragic event. The night was set. Laura made sure the kids were at her sister's house for a sleepover, and she and Tom stayed in. They watched a movie, and Laura pretended everything was normal, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for the moment. The night of the plan, Laura found herself hyper-aware of every movement, every word, every sound. It was as if her entire world had come into sharp focus, all leading to this one moment. She looked over at Tom, who was lounging on the couch, his face relaxed and content as he watched a comedy on the TV. The glow from the screen highlighted his features, and for a moment, Laura felt a pang of something. Maybe it was regret, or maybe it was fear. But she quickly pushed it away, reminding herself of why she was doing this. This was for her freedom, for the chance to live a life she deserved, a life where she didn't feel like she was invisible. Tom smiled at her, patting the seat beside him. "Laura, come sit with me. It's a good park," he said, his voice filled with the warmth that had once drawn her to him. Laura forced a smile, moving over to sit next to him. She leaned against him, and Tom wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong against her cheek, and it made her chest tighten. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but she couldn't. She had come too far to turn back now. The hours seemed to drag by, and Laura found herself glancing at the clock more often than she should have. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the point of no return. She felt a cold sweat on her back, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus on the movie, tried to act normal. Tom didn't seem to notice. He was too engrossed in the storyline, laughing at the jokes, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. When the clock struck midnight, Laura's heart seemed to stop for a moment. She knew that Jason was coming, that he was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment. She excused herself, standing up and moving to the kitchen under the guise of getting a glass of water. She stood there, staring at the sink, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint creak of the back door opening. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned, her eyes wide. Jason stepped into the kitchen, his face obscured by the dark ski mask he wore. He was holding a crowbar, and his hands were shaking. For a moment, their eyes met, and Laura could see the fear in his gaze. "Laura," Jason whispered, his voice muffled by the mask. "Are you sure about this?" Laura swallowed hard, nodding. "We have to do this, Jason. It's the only way." Jason hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded, taking a deep breath. He turned and moved into the living room, and Laura followed, her heart pounding in her chest. Tom was still on the couch, his back to them, unaware of the danger creeping up behind him. Jason banged the crowbar against the wall, the sound echoing through the room. Tom jolted awake, his eyes wide with terror as he spun around. "Who are you? What do you want?" Tom shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Jason moved closer, shouting at Tom to stay down, to not move. The fear in Tom's eyes was real, and Laura could see him clutching his chest, his breathing ragged. It was working, just as she had planned, but then something went wrong. Tom, desperate to protect himself, lunged at Jason, his instincts overriding his fear. In the chaos, Jason swung the crowbar, the force of the blow sending Tom sprawling to the ground. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull, wet thud that seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Tom crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around his head, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jason froze, staring at what he had done, the crowbar slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. Laura screamed, her voice high and panicked, not out of fear, but because she realized that it had gone too far. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tom was supposed to have a heart attack, not this. Laura, I didn't mean to. Jason stammered, his voice cracking, his hands trembling as he looked at Tom's lifeless body. Laura rushed to Tom, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body. But it was too late. She could see the vacant look in his eyes, the way his chest no longer rose and fell. He was gone. The reality of what they had done hit her like a cold wave, and she felt her stomach churn, bile rising in her throat. They were murderers. There was no going back. Laura, what do we do? Jason's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale beneath the mask. He looked like a lost child, his eyes wide and filled with tears. Laura forced herself to take a deep breath, to think. They had to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. They couldn't let anyone find out what had really happened. She stood up, her legs shaky, and looked around the room, her mind racing. We have to make it look like a break-in, she said, her voice trembling. We have to make it look like he surprised you and you panicked. Jason nodded, though he looked far from convinced. He moved around the room, knocking over furniture, pulling out drawers, scattering their contents across the floor. Laura watched him, her heart heavy, her hands still stained with Tom's blood. She knew they had to be convincing. If there were any inconsistencies, the police would suspect something. They had to make it look real. Laura grabbed the phone, dialing 911, her voice frantic as she reported the break-in and her husband's death. She tried to sound panicked, to convey the shock and horror that she was supposed to be feeling. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, and Laura hung up, her hands trembling. The police arrived within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights casting an eerie glow over the house. Laura sat on the floor, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. She had to play the part perfectly. The grieving widow, devastated by the loss of her husband. Jason had slipped out the back door before the police arrived, disappearing into the night. He couldn't be seen there. It would raise too many questions. The officers moved around the house, taking in the scene, their faces grim. They asked Laura questions. What had happened, what she had seen, if she had recognized the intruder. Laura answered them, her voice shaking, her eyes filled with tears. She told them how she had been in the kitchen, how she had heard the commotion, how she had seen the masked man standing over Tom, how she had screamed and the intruder had fled. It was all a lie, but she told it so convincingly that even she almost believed it. But the investigation didn't go as smoothly as Laura had hoped. The detectives were thorough, and they began to notice inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry, and the neighbors hadn't seen anyone suspicious that night, except for Jason, who had been spotted leaving Laura's house earlier in the evening. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to raise suspicions. Days turned into weeks, and Laura found herself living in a constant state of fear. She was always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. She tried to go about her life as if everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. The house felt empty, the silence oppressive. The kids had returned, and Laura tried her best to be there for them, to comfort them, but it was hard. She could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they looked at her, as if they knew something was wrong. Jason, too, was falling apart. He avoided Laura, unable to face her, unable to face what they had done. When they did see each other, it was tense, awkward, the weight of their crime hanging between them. Jason was terrified of getting caught, of what would happen to him, of the guilt that was eating him alive. He had nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, the image of Tom's lifeless eyes haunting him. He couldn't take it anymore. One day, the police brought Jason in for questioning. They had found out about the affair. Neighbors had seen him coming and going from Laura's house at odd hours, and they had put two and two together. They questioned him about his relationship with Laura, about where he had been the night of Tom's death. Jason tried to lie, tried to cover for Laura, but he wasn't strong enough. The guilt, the fear, it was too much for him. He broke down, tears streaming down his face as he confessed everything. He told them about the affair, about how he had fallen in love with Laura, about how she had convinced him to help her. He told them about the plan to scare Tom, about how it had all gone horribly wrong. He told them how he hadn't meant to kill Tom, how it had been an accident, but how they had tried to cover it up, to make it look like a burglary. The police arrested Laura the next day. The once perfect housewife, the loving mother, was now exposed as a cold-blooded murderer. The scandal rocked Glenwood. The details of the affair and the murder splashed across every newspaper, every TV screen. The neighbors, who had once admired Laura, now looked at her with disgust, with horror. The children were taken away, placed in the care of Laura's sister, their lives shattered by the betrayal of their own mother. As Laura sat in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed in front of her, she felt nothing. The numbness had taken over, the reality of what she had done too much to bear. She had wanted freedom, had wanted happiness, but all she had found was emptiness. She had destroyed everything, her family, her lover, her own soul. And as she looked at her reflection in the one-way mirror, she saw not the woman she had once been, but a stranger, a monster, and she wondered for the first time if it had all been worth it, if the price of her freedom had been too high. The days after Laura's arrest were a blur of flashing cameras, courtroom appearances, and hushed whispers that echoed through the hallways of the courthouse. Reporters clamored for details, their relentless questions trying to pry into the deepest, darkest corners of her life. Every day seemed to bleed into the next, and Laura could hardly remember when she had last slept without waking up in a panic, the realization of what she had done hitting her like a tidal wave each time she opened her eyes. Laura's attorney was a weary, middle-aged man named Frank Gibbons. He had seen it all: gangsters, con men, killers. He knew that the cards were stacked against him from the start. The evidence was overwhelming. Jason's confession, the timeline of events, and the neighbors' statements all pointed to her guilt. Frank had explained to her that their best chance was to plead guilty, to try to negotiate a reduced sentence. Laura could see the pity in his eyes every time he spoke to her, and she hated it. She didn't want pity. She didn't want sympathy. She just wanted it all to go away. Jason, meanwhile, was held in a separate facility, his testimony recorded in painstaking detail. The boy who had once been full of life, so eager to love, was now a shell of his former self. He had broken down completely in the police station, his voice cracking and his eyes hollow as he recounted what had happened. The authorities treated him with a mix of disdain and sympathy. They knew he had been manipulated, that Laura had taken advantage of his youth and naivety, but they couldn't ignore the fact that he had taken a life. Jason's parents were devastated. They had always thought their son was a good kid, a little lost perhaps, but nothing like this. His mother, Mrs. Harrison, visited him every day, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling as she held us through the thick glass partition in the visitation room. She tried to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be all right, but Jason knew better. He had killed a man, and no amount of comfort could change that. He felt the crushing weight of his actions, and he wondered if he would ever feel anything else. The trial began in earnest, and the courtroom was filled with spectators, neighbors, reporters, even strangers who were drawn to the spectacle of it all. People who had once smiled at Laura in the grocery store now sat in judgment, their faces hard and unforgiving. Laura felt their eyes on her, felt their hatred, and it was almost unbearable. She kept her head down, her hands folded in her lap, trying to block out the noise, the accusations, the damning evidence. Tom's family was there, too. His parents, elderly and frail, sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief. Laura couldn't bring herself to look at them. She knew that there was nothing she could say or do that would ever make up for what she had done. She had taken their son from them, robbed them of a chance to say goodbye. She had betrayed the man who had loved her, who had given her everything he had. And now, she was left to face the consequences of her actions. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Porter, was relentless. She painted a picture of Laura as a manipulative, cold-hearted woman who had seduced a young boy and convinced him to commit murder for her own selfish gain. She brought up Laura's affair with Jason, the lies she had told, the way she had plotted to get rid of her husband. She spoke of Tom's love for his family, how he had worked tirelessly to provide for them, how he had trusted Laura with his heart, only to have it shattered in the worst possible way. Helen called Jason to the stand, and the courtroom fell silent as he walked to the witness box. He looked frail, his shoulders slumped, his eyes avoiding Laura's as he took his seat. Helen questioned him gently, asking him to recount what had happened, how he had gotten involved with Laura, how he had come to believe that killing Tom was the only way they could be together. Jason spoke in a low, trembling voice, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He told the court how he had fallen in love with Laura, how she had made him feel special, like he was the only one who mattered. He spoke of the thrill of their secret meetings, the way she had made him believe that they could have a future together. He spoke of the plan, how Laura had convinced him that it was the only way, how he had believed her, how he had wanted to protect her, to make her happy. When he spoke of the night of the murder, his voice broke and tears filled his eyes. He described how he had entered the house, how Tom had woken up, the panic, the struggle, the moment when everything had gone wrong. He spoke of the sickening realization of what he had done, the way Laura had tried to cover it up, the way he had run terrified from the scene. His words were filled with regret, with sorrow, and Laura could see the pain etched into every line of his face. When it was Frank's turn to cross-examine Jason, he tried to paint him as an impulsive, impressionable young man who had acted out of infatuation, who had been caught up in something far beyond his understanding. He tried to shift some of the blame away from Laura, to make it seem as if Jason had acted on his own, but it was clear that the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was too damning, the story too clear. Laura had been the instigator, the mastermind. Jason had been her pawn, but he was still guilty. When Laura took the stand, she felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, with nothing but darkness below. Frank had told her to be honest, to show remorse, to try to make the jury see that she was human, that she had made a terrible mistake. Laura spoke of her loneliness, of how she had felt neglected, invisible. She spoke of how she had fallen for Jason, how she had seen him as an escape, a way out of the life that had begun to feel like a prison. She spoke of the plan, how she had never meant for anyone to get hurt, how it had all spiraled out of control. But as she spoke, she could see the faces of the jury, their eyes hard and unyielding. They didn't see a woman who had made a mistake. They saw a murderer, a woman who had taken advantage of a young boy and manipulated him into committing an unspeakable crime. They saw someone who had betrayed her family, her husband, her children. They saw someone who had taken a life without a second thought. The verdict was swift and unsurprising, guilty. The judge sentenced Laura to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jason, due to his age and the mitigating circumstances, received a lesser sentence, 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the sentences were read, but Laura barely heard them. She felt numb, her body heavy, her mind blank. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. As the guards led her away, she caught a glimpse of her children, Emily and Nathan, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Laura's sister. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with tears. Nathan looked confused, scared, his small hand clutching his aunt's. Laura's heart broke at the sight of them. She had done this to them. She had destroyed their lives, taken away their father, and now she was being taken from them too. She wanted to tell them she was sorry, that she loved them, but the words caught in her throat. Laura was taken to a maximum security prison, her life reduced to a small cell, her days filled with monotony and regret. The other inmates knew who she was. Many had seen her story on the news, had read about her in the papers. Some were sympathetic, others were hostile. But Laura kept to herself, avoiding confrontation, avoiding conversation. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to think. She just wanted to disappear. Jason, meanwhile, was sent to a juvenile detention center to serve out his sentence. He was haunted by what he had done, the image of Tom's lifeless body a constant presence in his mind. He spent his days and a daze, going through the motions, trying to make sense of what his life had become. He knew he had been manipulated, but that didn't absolve him of his guilt. He had taken a life, and he would have to live with that for the rest of his days. The town of Glenwood was forever changed by the events on Willow Lane. The Parker house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now stood empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. Their once friendly community now tinged with suspicion and fear. People locked their doors at night, kept their children close, as if the darkness that had consumed the Parkers might somehow spread to them. Emily and Nathan went to live with their aunt, their young lives forever scarred by the loss of both their parents. Emily stopped painting, her once vivid imagination now filled with nightmares she couldn't escape. Nathan, too young to fully understand what had happened, clung to his sister, looking to her for comfort, for answers. But Emily had none to give. She was just as lost, just as broken. Years passed, and the story of Laura Parker and Jason Harrison became something of an urban legend in Glenwood, a cautionary tale of love gone wrong, of betrayal, of the darkness that can hide behind the most innocent of facades. People whispered about it at parties, told the story to newcomers, each retelling more embellished than the last. But for those who had lived it, who had known the people involved, there was nothing romantic or mysterious about it. It was just a tragedy, one that had destroyed lives, shattered families, and left a lingering sense of unease in its wake. And as Laura sat in her cell, staring at the gray walls that surrounded her, she wondered if it had all been worth it. The freedom she had craved, the happiness she had sought, none of it had come to pass. She had lost everything: her husband, her children, her lover, her own soul. And all she was left with was regret, a deep, gnawing emptiness that would never be filled. In the end, Laura realized she had been her own worst enemy. She had allowed her desires, her fears, her loneliness to consume her, to drive her to do the unthinkable. And now, she was left to live with the consequences of her actions, alone, forever haunted by the choices she had made. And in the quiet of her cell, Laura couldn't help but wonder, if she had chosen differently, if she had been stronger, could she have found another way? Could she have found happiness without destroying everything she loved? It was a question that would haunt her for the rest of her days. A question that had no answer, only the cold, unrelenting reality of what she had done.